The first distress call came from Kepler station at 0347 hours, UTC. Unidentified fleet approaching, the station commander reported, his voice steady despite the obvious tension beneath the professional tone. Contact count, 247 vessels. All maintaining attack formation. We are implementing emergency protocols. Estimated time to engagement, 14 minutes. The transmission cut out before Earth Defense Command could respond. The second distress call came from Mars colony 47 seconds later. Multiple energy signatures detected in low Martian orbit. Weapon targeting systems active. We are evacuating non-essential personnel. Repeating, this is not a drill. This is an actual military engagement. Then silence. And then the calls kept coming. Europa Station. Venus Mining Collective. The Belt Settlements. The Deep Space Research Platforms. The terraforming colonies in the outer system. Every human settlement simultaneously reporting the arrival of an unknown hostile force of unprecedented scale. In the Earth Defense Command Center, Commander Alexandra Park watched the reports accumulate on her tactical display with growing disbelief. Status, she demanded. Her operations officer, a woman named Chen who had been with Park for 15 years, shook her head. We're receiving extinction-level threat assessments from 23 separate colony locations. Energy signatures consistent with capital-class vessels. Fleet configurations indicating coordinated attack doctrine. Ma'am, if these readings are accurate, someone has assembled a military force that exceeds Conclave capabilities. Park stared at the display. Confirm with secondary sources. Get me independent verification. Already doing it, ma'am. But the colony reports are consistent. The same attack profile. The same timing. Multiple locations simultaneously. Park's mind was moving through scenarios at operational speed. A force of that magnitude could not have assembled without notice. A coordinated attack across the entire human space could not have been planned without someone detecting the preparations. Unless someone wanted it to look like they hadn't detected it. Unless this was something else entirely. Put me on all channels communication, Park ordered. Address all reporting colonies. Her communications officer made the connections, and Park's voice went out across human space to every settlement under attack. All units, this is Commander Park. I'm ordering a complete cessation of all emergency evacuation procedures. I repeat, cease all evacuation. Stand down defensive systems. Await further instruction. The silence that followed was profound. From Kepler station, the commander's voice came back, shaking with barely controlled fury, "Ma'am, we have hostile military assets firing on civilian positions." With respect, that order doesn't make tactical sense. Commander, are your defensive systems registering actual weapons fire or are they registering targeting lock-ons? A pause. Targeting lock-ons, ma'am. No actual weapons discharge. But the formations, Commander, I'm ordering you to stand down. That's not a request. Park turned to her tactical officer. Run a trace on those fleet signatures. Cross-reference them against every military database we have access to. The tactical officer worked for 90 seconds that felt like years. Ma'am, these fleet signatures are not in any database. But the formation patterns, they're Conclave standard. Specifically, old Conclave standard. From about 30 years ago. Park felt something shift in her understanding. How old? From the Breaking Wars era. The tactical formations are from military doctrine that's been superseded by all modern Conclave members. Park looked at her communications officer. Get me the Conclave assembly. High priority. I need to speak with whoever authorized this immediately. High Warden North's voice came through the secure channel with the kind of calm that only came from witnessing 400 years of galactic history. Commander Park, Orth began, I assume you've begun to understand what you're actually observing. Someone has sent a fake invasion fleet, Park said carefully. Someone with access to old military databases and the ability to create convincing false signatures. Someone who wanted to scare every human colony simultaneously. Not just scare, Orth replied. Test. Park's hand tightened on her communications device. Test what? How quickly humanity responds to existential threat. What your governmental structures prioritize when survival is at stake. Whether your leaders maintain discipline or fracture under pressure. How your military command structure functions when facing overwhelming force. In short, we wanted to see how humans actually behave when they believe they're about to be extinct. Park felt anger rise in her chest, sharp and immediate. You sent the entire human race into panic to conduct a psychological experiment. We sent your leadership into a controlled scenario to test your crisis management capabilities, Orth corrected gently. The civilian populations were not informed to prevent contamination of the data. But we were monitoring your responses at every level. Who authorized this? Who in the conclave thought this was acceptable? It was a unanimous decision, Orth said. Made during a session classified at the highest levels. You weren't informed because informing you would compromise the test parameters. Park closed her eyes for a moment, controlling her breathing. Why? Orth was quiet for a moment. Because humanity is being considered for advancement to a higher tier of galactic participation. A tier that requires facing existential scenarios without breaking. Your species has proven militarily capable. You've proven politically adaptable. But we needed to understand if you could maintain organizational integrity when your entire civilization was believed to be under extinction threat. And? What did you learn? That's why I'm calling you, Commander. You stopped the panic. You verified the threat rather than escalating. You thought instead of reacting. That suggests your species has the psychological stability necessary for advancement. Park opened her eyes. What kind of advancement? We can discuss that when you've had time to process what's actually occurred. But for now, you should know that the exercise is over. You can inform all colonies that the threat has been reclassified as a training scenario. Casualties, 0. Damage, minimal. But the data we've collected is invaluable. The communication ended. Park sat in her command center surrounded by displays showing fake invasions attacking fake targets, and she realized she was furious not just at the conclave, but at herself for not recognizing the deception faster. Humanity had nearly fallen apart because the leadership had trusted a threat that wasn't real. And the conclave had been watching the entire time. The announcement that the extinction threat had been a test went out across human space at 1407 hours UTC. The response was not relief. It was rage. Kepler Station, which had reported casualties from the weapons fire that had never actually occurred, demanded an explanation of how much of the damage had been real and how much had been simulation. The answer: it was all simulation. There had been no weapons fire. The colony commanders had misidentified automated defense systems firing at designated targets within safe parameters as actual combat. Mars colony demanded compensation for the evacuation procedures that had damaged delicate terraforming infrastructure in an emergency shutdown that had never been necessary. Europa Station demanded answers about why the conclave had been allowed to broadcast false military signatures into human space without warning. And in Earth's government chambers, the political backlash began immediately. A statement from the North American Federation called the exercise a gross violation of human sovereignty. The European Union demanded a formal apology from the conclave. The Pacific Coalition called for immediate review of all conclave relationships and possible withdrawal from galactic treaties. The Chinese authority issued a single sentence: the conclave has demonstrated that it cannot be trusted. We will prepare accordingly. Commander Park found herself in emergency meetings with every human governmental body simultaneously, all of them demanding explanations and reassurances that she could not provide. She sent a message to High Warden Orth requesting a formal explanation that could be distributed to humanity without further destabilizing the situation. Orth's response came quickly. Tell them we were testing their ability to handle existential threat. Tell them the test revealed encouraging data about their capacity for rational response under pressure. Tell them that based on this test, humanity is being advanced to Tier 3 status in conclave governance structures. Tell them that this advancement means access to restricted technologies, participation in closed session council meetings, and equal voice in galactic security decisions. Park read the message twice. And then she made a decision that would have consequences neither she nor the conclave had anticipated. She had learned from the conclave's mistakes. She would not keep humanity in the dark. She would not rely on government-to-government communication. She would broadcast directly to every human being capable of receiving the transmission. Park went to the Public Communications Center and recorded a message that would be transmitted across all human networks simultaneously. "This is Commander Alexandra Park," she began. "I'm going to tell you what happened today. All of it. Because you deserve to know exactly what the conclave did and exactly what it means." She explained the exercise. The false invasion fleet. The simultaneous reports from every colony. The coordinated test of humanity's response to existential threat. And then she explained something the conclave had been careful not to include in their communication to her. Before the test was authorized, the conclave conducted a risk assessment. A leaked document that came to my attention suggests they considered the possibility that the test could trigger actual conflict. They assessed the odds of human panic leading to military action that could spiral into actual war with conclave forces at 12%. They considered this acceptable risk. Park paused, letting that sink in. The conclave was willing to gamble with a 12% chance of accidentally starting a war with our species in order to gather psychological data. They did not inform us because informing us would have contaminated their data. In other words, they valued their test more than they valued transparent communication with a member species. Another pause. But here's what I need you to understand: the test was also an opportunity. Because how we respond to this violation of trust will determine humanity's actual standing in the galactic community. Park leaned forward. The conclave offered humanity advancement to Tier 3 status based on our response to their test. What they don't know is that we can reject that advancement. We can demand accountability. We can demand that any future tests be conducted with our informed consent. And we can threaten to withdraw from conclave governance structures if those demands aren't met. She smiled slightly. We're not weak, humanity. We're not a species that accepts violations of trust quietly. We're a species that turns violations into leverage. The message ended. And the galaxy, watching the broadcast, suddenly understood something it had not understood before. The test had not been designed to test humanity. It had been designed to test whether humanity would accept being tested without consent. And the answer, it turned out, was no. The conclave assembly called for an emergency session within hours of Park's broadcast. High Warden North found himself in the unusual position of defending the test he had authorized to a chamber full of species that were suddenly questioning whether the conclave had the right to conduct such tests on member species at all. The test served a necessary function, Orth argued. We needed to assess humanity's psychological stability under existential threat. That assessment required authenticity of threat perception. Ambassador Shura, one of the conclave's more progressive members, stood to respond. Did it require the lack of informed consent? Did it require deceiving an entire species about the nature of the threat they were facing? High Warden, you've conducted hundreds of psychological assessments of other species over the centuries. How many of them were conducted without consent? Orth was silent. The answer is all of them, Shura continued. Every single assessment was conducted without the species knowing they were being tested. Because, as you just demonstrated, informed consent would contaminate the data. But perhaps, High Warden, data obtained through deception is not worth the cost. The chamber erupted in debate. Species that had never questioned conclave authority suddenly began questioning whether the conclave had the right to conduct secret tests on its own members. Species that had accepted hidden assessments as normal procedures suddenly began wondering what other tests they had been subjected to without knowledge. The political structure of the conclave, which had been stable for 300 years, began to develop fissures. Park watched from Earth as the conclave tore itself apart over a principle: the right of member species to be informed when they were being tested. It was not what she had intended. She had intended to create leverage. Instead, she had created something more profound. She had created doubt about whether the system itself was just. The conclave ordered a full accounting of every assessment, test, and evaluation it had conducted on member species over the past 300 years. The documents, when compiled, revealed a disturbing picture. Humanity had been tested 73 times without their knowledge. The breaking wars had partially been allowed to occur to assess human military capability. The resource restrictions after the wars had been partially designed to measure how humanity would respond to political pressure. But humanity was not alone. Every species in the conclave had been tested. Some species dozens of times. Some species hundreds of times. Some tests involved orchestrating economic crises to measure political stability. Some tests involved arranging minor military conflicts to assess military performance. Some tests involved introducing false scientific data to measure how species would handle misinformation. The conclave had been conducting secret experiments on its own member species for 300 years. And everyone had just accepted it as normal procedure. Until humanity had broadcast their refusal to accept it. The political crisis that followed lasted 18 months. 4 species threatened to withdraw from the conclave. 12 species demanded the resignation of High Warden North and the entire Senior Council. 27 species demanded a complete reformation of conclave governance structures to include transparency requirements and informed consent protocols for any future testing. The conclave, faced with the possibility of collapse, was forced to adapt. New protocols were established. Any future assessment of member species would require advance notice and informed consent. Historical records of all secret tests would be declassified and made available to affected species. Reparations would be offered to species that had suffered damage due to orchestrated tests. The conclave, in essence, was forced to acknowledge that it had committed a systematic violation of the autonomy and dignity of its own member species. And it was forced to commit to never doing it again. Or at least, to never doing it again without admitting what it was doing. Commander Park found herself summoned to the conclave assembly 6 months after her broadcast. She arrived expecting condemnation. Instead, she found respect. Commander Park, High Warden North said, his ancient voice carrying a kind of weary acknowledgement, "You did something remarkable. You recognized that the greatest threat to the conclave was not external military force, but internal corruption of its foundational principles." Park did not respond immediately. "What you forced us to acknowledge," Orth continued, "is that we had become what we claimed to protect against. We had become a power structure that valued information more than integrity. That valued control more than consent." "I didn't force anything," Park said quietly. "You did that to yourselves. I just made sure everyone knew what you were doing." "Yes," Orth agreed. "And that's what made it so effective. You didn't fight us militarily. You didn't demand reparations or punishment. You simply ensured that transparency replaced secrecy. And in doing so, you made the conclave better." Park was surprised by the acknowledgement. "The conclave is offering humanity formal elevation to Tier 2 governance status," Orth continued. "Not because of your military capability or your economic value, but because you've demonstrated the capacity to improve the system you're part of through honest communication. That is rarer than you might think." Park stood to respond, then sat back down. "I want something in writing," she said finally. "A commitment that all member species will be informed of any future testing. A commitment that historical assessments will be fully declassified. And a commitment that the conclave will establish an oversight body with equal representation from all member species to monitor future governance." "Agreed," Orth said immediately. Park blinked. She had expected negotiation. She had not expected immediate compliance. "Why are you accepting these terms without pushback?" Orth smiled, an expression that looked strange on his ancient face. "Because you're right," he said simply. "And because accepting this now prevents something worse from happening later. We learned that lesson from you." The reformation of the conclave had consequences that spread far beyond the governing body itself. Species that had never trusted the conclave suddenly began participating more actively in its processes. Information that had been classified for centuries was released to public scrutiny. Decision-making processes that had been opaque became transparent. The conclave did not become perfect. Power structures rarely do. But it became better. Fairer. More accountable. And the catalyst for that transformation was not military force or technological breakthrough. It was a single commander who had recognized that the best leverage comes not from threats, but from truth. 3 years after the exercise, Dr. Marcus Vail, the same Marcus Vail who had orchestrated the conclave broadcast 30 years earlier, requested a meeting with Commander Park. They met in a private chamber on Arova Prime, away from the machinery of government. "You did what I couldn't do," Vail said without preamble. "I exposed corruption. You forced reform. There's a difference. I learned from watching what you did, Park admitted. You showed that truth matters more than any weapon. I just applied that lesson to a different situation. No, Vale said. You did something harder. You forced the system to admit it was corrupt while keeping the system intact. I would have destroyed it. You improved it. Park considered this. Do you regret what you did? She asked. Vale was quiet for a moment. Every day, he said finally. And I would do it again. Because transformation requires someone to be willing to break things. I was that person. I broke the Conclave's image of itself as a force for justice. You were the person who built something better from the pieces. They sat in silence for a while. High Warden North, in his private meditations, considered the strange trajectory of his long life. He had witnessed the Conclave grow from a small governing body into the dominant force in galactic politics. He had guided its expansion. He had authorized hundreds of secret tests designed to maintain control and measure stability. And he had done it believing it was necessary. Believing it was just. Believing it served the greater good. Until Commander Park had made him see himself as others saw him. Not a wise guardian of galactic peace. But a controller. A manipulator. A force that valued information more than the dignity of the species it governed. Orth wrote in his final personal record, I have lived for 417 years. I have seen species rise and fall. I have guided the Conclave through crises and transformations. I believed myself wise. I believed myself just. Commander Alexandra Park taught me that wisdom and justice are not the same as control. She taught me that transparency is harder than secrecy. She taught me that the greatest strength comes not from the ability to manipulate, but from the willingness to be transparent. I do not know if I will be remembered as a force for good or as a warning against the corruption of power. I hope it is the latter. I hope other leaders will see what I became and choose differently. But perhaps that is too much to hope. Power corrupts. That is simply the nature of power. The only defense against corruption is transparency. The only remedy for corruption is accountability. Commander Park understood this. I am only beginning to. Orth set down his recording device. He would live another 37 years. He would see the reforms he had been forced to accept mature and strengthen. He would see the Conclave become, incrementally and imperfectly, more just. And he would never quite stop wondering what might have happened if Commander Park had not had the courage to broadcast the truth. 50 years after the exercise, a young historian was reviewing records of what had come to be called the test incident and was struck by something subtle in the data. In her analysis, she discovered something buried in Orth's personal logs. The original risk assessment that had predicted a 12% chance of the test triggering actual war had been deliberately leaked to Park. It had not been accidental. It had been intentional. Orth had planted the information knowing that Park would find it. Knowing that Park would use it. Knowing that Park would broadcast it. In other words, Orth had orchestrated his own exposure. The historian brought this discovery to the current Conclave leadership. The response was silence. When pressed, the current High Warden simply said, some tests cannot be passed unless the test taker believes they're discovering the truth themselves. Orth understood that. He designed the situation to force humanity to choose transparency. And then he made sure they would have the information necessary to do so. So the entire thing was orchestrated, the historian asked. The false invasion? The exposure? The reformation? Not orchestrated, the High Warden replied carefully. Guided. There's a difference. The responses were authentic. The data was real. But the initial setup was designed to create the conditions where the right answer would become obvious. The historian left the meeting deeply unsettled. Because it meant that even the reformation of the Conclave had been, in a sense, another test. And no one had told humanity they were being tested again.